Where to, sir? Frank Rodriguez asked as businessman James Patterson settled into the backseat of the yellow taxi, neither man aware that the solar storm affecting satellite communications throughout Washington, D.C. was about to reveal geographic knowledge that seemed impossible for a driver who claimed to have been working the city for only 2 years. Reagan National Airport, Terminal B. James replied, checking his phone to find that GPS applications were showing signal unavailable, warnings that had left rideshare drivers stranded and confused throughout the metropolitan area. No problem, sir, Frank said with quiet confidence as he began navigating through the complex network of streets, shortcuts, and alternate routes with systematic precision that impressed James with an efficiency and apparent intuitive understanding of traffic patterns, construction delays, and optimal pathways that seemed to indicate decades of experience rather than recent familiarity. What James didn't know was that the man driving him through Washington, D.C. without any electronic navigation assistance was Francisco Rodriguez, retired CIA operations officer who had spent 22 years conducting classified missions in foreign capitals where memorizing complex urban geography, surveillance routes, and escape pathways had often meant the difference between mission success and potentially fatal exposure. Frank Rodriguez, 51 years old, had been driving taxi in Washington, D.C. for 2 years and 3 months, maintaining the same methodical attention to geographic detail and route analysis that had characterized his 22-year career as a CIA operations officer conducting classified missions in foreign countries. Every morning at 5:30 a.m., he inspected his taxi with systematic thoroughness, reviewed traffic reports and construction updates, and mentally rehearsed optimal routes throughout the metropolitan area using geographic memory techniques that he had developed during years of operational work in hostile environments. The taxi company and regular passengers knew Frank as the driver who could find any destination, who somehow avoided traffic delays that trapped other drivers, and who provided reliable service regardless of weather conditions, special events, or infrastructure problems that disrupted normal transportation throughout the city. He had developed a reputation for professionalism, punctuality, and geographic knowledge that made him one of the most requested drivers in the company's fleet. What passengers didn't notice was Frank's automatic threat assessment as he drove through different neighborhoods, the way he planned multiple route options for every destination, the way he maintained constant situational awareness that went far beyond what typical taxi driving required. His approach to urban navigation was systematic and comprehensive in ways that suggested training beyond normal transportation experience. Frank had chosen taxi driving specifically because it allowed him to use geographic knowledge and navigation skills in peaceful, straightforward contexts after 22 years of intelligence work that had required him to memorize complex foreign cities while conducting operations where geographic mistakes could compromise missions and endanger lives. His CIA career had begun in 1999 when the agency recruited him from Georgetown University, where he was completing advanced studies in international relations with concentrations in Latin American politics and urban geography. The combination of language abilities, cultural knowledge, and demonstrated aptitude for geographic analysis had made him an ideal candidate for operations work during a period when the CIA was expanding human intelligence capabilities. Frank's training had been extensive and classified. Months at CIA facilities learning everything from advanced surveillance techniques to cultural immersion, geographic memorization methods, and operational security procedures designed for conducting intelligence operations in foreign urban environments. He had specialized in developing geographic intelligence capabilities that allowed him to operate effectively in cities where detailed maps were unavailable or unreliable. Frank's assignments had included operations in Latin America, Eastern Europe, and Southeast Asia, where he had conducted intelligence gathering, asset recruitment, and liaison coordination that required perfect knowledge of complex urban environments. He had spent years living undercover identities in foreign capitals, memorizing street layouts, surveillance routes, and operational pathways while gathering intelligence on political and military developments. Over multiple operational tours, Frank had demonstrated exceptional geographic intelligence capabilities that had contributed to successful missions and earned recognition for operational excellence. But the psychological pressure of years spent living false identities in potentially hostile environments, constantly assessing threats while maintaining cover, had eventually become exhausting. When Frank retired from the CIA, he He had been offered positions with private intelligence firms, security consulting companies, and government contractors that would have used his operational expertise in lucrative international assignments. But after more than 2 decades of complex intelligence work, Frank had chosen taxi driving because it allowed him to use navigation and geographic skills to help people while remaining in familiar, safe environments. Washington, D.C. was a complex metropolitan area with more than 600,000 residents and millions of daily commuters navigating a city designed with security considerations, historical preservation requirements, and political symbolism that created challenging transportation networks. Frank's taxi service area covered the entire District of Columbia plus portions of Virginia and Maryland that comprised the greater Washington metropolitan region. During his 2 years of taxi driving, Frank had developed comprehensive knowledge of the metropolitan area that impressed passengers, dispatchers, and fellow drivers with its accuracy and practical utility for efficient transportation service. "Frank," said regular passenger DR, Lisa Martinez, a State Department employee who uses taxi service for airport transportation, "your knowledge of D.C. traffic patterns and alternate routes is remarkable. You always get me to my destination faster than GPS estimates." DR, Martinez, "I enjoy learning about the city and finding efficient routes. Good geographic knowledge helps provide better service." What DR Martinez didn't realize was that Frank's good geographic knowledge was based on intelligence techniques he had learned from memorizing foreign cities during operational assignments, systematic geographic analysis, route memorization, and navigation methods that he had developed for much more complex and dangerous purposes. The day when Frank's background was revealed began with atmospheric conditions that created exactly the type of navigation challenge that tested every aspect of his CIA training. A solar storm was affecting satellite communications throughout the eastern United States, causing GPS systems to provide inaccurate or unavailable location data that left drivers throughout the metropolitan area confused and unable to navigate effectively. Multiple transportation services had suspended operations, but Frank continued providing taxi service using manual navigation techniques that didn't depend on electronic assistance. James Patterson, a management consultant who regularly traveled to Washington for government contract work, had booked Frank's taxi for airport transportation after discovering that rideshare applications were showing no drivers available messages throughout the city. "Frank," James said as they began the journey, "are you sure you can get to the airport without GPS? My phone shows no signal, and most drivers seem to be having navigation problems." "No problem, Mr. Patterson. I know the routes to all airports from any location in the metropolitan area." Frank's navigation during the solar storm demonstrated geographic capabilities that went far beyond typical taxi driver experience. He used landmark recognition, traffic pattern analysis, and route optimization techniques that allowed him to avoid areas where other drivers were experiencing delays or confusion due to GPS failures. During the 40-minute drive, Frank provided commentary about Washington, D.C. neighborhoods, historical landmarks, and traffic management that demonstrated not just geographic knowledge, but analytical understanding of urban systems that impressed James with its sophistication. "Frank, your knowledge of the city is incredible. How long have you been driving here?" "About 2 years, Mr. Patterson. I enjoy learning about urban geography and transportation systems." James was puzzled by Frank's claim of only 2 years' experience. "Frank, your understanding of D.C. traffic patterns and geography seems much more extensive than 2 years would provide. Do you have other experience with navigation or urban planning?" Frank hesitated, the way he always did when passengers asked about his background. "Some experience with geographic analysis and route planning, sir. I've always been interested in how cities work." But James, whose consulting work involved evaluating government personnel and operations, recognized that Frank's geographic capabilities suggested training beyond typical civilian experience. "Frank, your geographic knowledge and analytical approach to navigation are exceptional. What kind of background do you have in geographic analysis?" The conversation was interrupted by radio reports about the solar storm's effects on transportation throughout the region. Multiple airports were experiencing delays. Government agencies were implementing backup communication protocols, and emergency services were coordinating response to the widespread GPS failures. Frank listened to the reports while continuing to navigate efficiently toward Reagan National Airport, demonstrating geographic knowledge and route planning that functioned independently of any technological assistance. Mr. Patterson, Frank said as they approached the airport, the solar storm is affecting electronic systems throughout the region, but traditional navigation methods still work effectively. James was impressed not just by Frank's successful navigation, but by his calm professionalism during conditions that had overwhelmed other transportation services. Frank, your navigation during this emergency has been exceptional. You seem to understand geographic systems at a level that goes beyond typical driving experience. When they arrived at Reagan National Airport ahead of schedule, despite the regional transportation crisis, James felt compelled to ask more direct questions about Frank's background. Frank, I work with government personnel evaluation, and your geographic capabilities are at a level I typically see from intelligence or military professionals. What's your actual background? The conversation that followed revealed Frank's CIA experience and his reasons for choosing taxi driving over careers that would more obviously use his intelligence operations expertise. Mr. Patterson, I spent 22 years as a CIA operations officer conducting intelligence work in foreign countries. I retired and chose taxi driving because I wanted to use geographic and navigation skills in peaceful, helpful ways. James understood immediately why Frank's navigation had been so comprehensive and professional. Frank, CIA operations training is among the most demanding geographic education available. Why taxi driving? Frank explained his transition from intelligence work, his desire for straightforward work that didn't recreate the stress and complexity of operational assignments, and his satisfaction with using his skills to provide reliable transportation service for his community. Mr. Patterson, after years of memorizing foreign cities for intelligence operations, I wanted to use the same skills to help people navigate my own country in safe, positive contexts. James was intrigued by Frank's perspective on his career transition and his application of intelligence skills to civilian service. Frank, have you considered that your geographic expertise could be valuable for emergency management or urban planning? The conversation with James Patterson led to Frank being contacted by Washington, D.C. emergency management officials who were interested in his navigation capabilities for disaster response and crisis coordination. Frank, said Emergency Management Director Patricia Williams during their meeting the following week, your ability to navigate during the solar storm when GPS systems were failing demonstrated capabilities that could be valuable for emergency response operations. Frank was initially reluctant to return to work that reminded him of intelligence operations, but the emergency management position offered a compromise between using his expertise and maintaining the peaceful transportation work that had been essential for his transition from CIA service. MS. Williams, I chose taxi driving specifically to step away from complex operational work. Frank, this wouldn't be intelligence operations. We need someone to develop navigation protocols for emergency personnel and coordinate transportation during disasters when electronic systems are unreliable. Frank accepted the part-time position as emergency transportation coordinator while continuing his taxi driving work. The combination allowed him to use his CIA geographic expertise to improve community emergency preparedness while maintaining the routine transportation work that provided stability and satisfaction. Frank's emergency management programs emphasize practical navigation techniques that function independently of GPS technology, map reading skills, landmark recognition, and route planning that prepared emergency responders for situations where electronic navigation systems were unavailable. The goal, Frank explained to emergency response trainees, is developing navigation confidence that doesn't depend on technology. Electronic systems are valuable tools, but they're not always available during emergencies. Frank's work with emergency navigation training led to his developing protocols that were adopted by emergency management agencies throughout the D.C. metropolitan area. His programs prepared emergency personnel while improving coordination between different response organizations during disasters. 6 months after the solar storm incident, Frank received recognition from both the International Association of Emergency Managers and the CIA Officers Memorial Foundation for developing civilian navigation training programs that improve community emergency preparedness. But the recognition that meant the most to Frank came from taxi passengers who had received reliable transportation service during conditions that had disrupted most other services throughout the city. "Frank," said DR Martinez during one of her regular airport trips, "I heard about your work with emergency management. That explains how you're so reliable during difficult conditions." DR Martinez, "Reliable transportation is important to me. I don't like disappointing passengers who are depending on taxi service." Frank realized that DR Martinez's comment reflected exactly the kind of meaningful work he had hoped to find after leaving intelligence service, using his geographic expertise to serve his community reliably while building relationships based on dependable service rather than operational necessity. A year after the solar storm navigation incident, Frank had become Washington, D.C.'s community emergency navigation specialist, responsible for training emergency personnel and developing transportation protocols that improved disaster response throughout the region. His programs included civilian emergency preparedness, family emergency planning, and basic navigation skills that prepared community members for situations where electronic navigation systems were unavailable. "The key," Frank explained to community groups during his navigation training sessions, "is understanding that navigation is a skill that can be learned and practiced. People who develop basic navigation confidence are much more prepared for emergencies." 2 years after demonstrating his geographic capabilities during the GPS outage, Frank continued driving taxi while also serving as a recognized expert in emergency navigation and urban transportation planning. His story was featured in intelligence community publications as an example of how operational skills could be applied to civilian community service, inspiring other retired CIA officers to consider careers that use their expertise for peaceful community benefit. Today, Frank Rodriguez continues working as a taxi driver while also directing emergency navigation training programs for Washington, D.C. and surrounding communities. He still arrives every morning at 5:30 a.m., still provides transportation for passengers throughout the metropolitan area, and still treats taxi service as a serious professional responsibility. But he also trains emergency personnel in navigation techniques, develops protocols that improve disaster response, and teaches basic navigation skills to families and community groups who want to be prepared for emergencies. The taxi company where Frank works displays a small framed certificate that reads, "In appreciation of professional service that connects our community." Frank requested that the recognition focus on transportation service rather than individual achievement. Frank's story reminds us that intelligence operations expertise doesn't diminish when applied to civilian purposes. It enhances. That CIA geographic training can improve civilian emergency preparedness just as effectively as it supports intelligence operations in foreign countries. That the same navigation techniques used for covert operations can be used to provide reliable transportation service and community emergency preparedness. The next time you take a taxi, remember Frank Rodriguez. Remember that the driver providing your transportation might have geographic experience gained in countries and situations you can't imagine. Remember that they might have chosen taxi service not because they lack other qualifications, but because they found meaningful ways to apply extraordinary skills to serve their community in peaceful, helpful contexts. Sometimes the most important navigation happens not in foreign intelligence operations or classified missions, but on city streets where former CIA officers choose to use their expertise to provide reliable transportation and emergency preparedness for families who depend on professional service. Sometimes the greatest geographic expertise belongs to people driving taxis rather than conducting covert operations, people who've chosen to apply intelligence training to civilian community service, ensuring that the skills developed for foreign operations can be used to enhance local transportation and emergency response. We need to recognize and appreciate the skilled navigation professionals among us who've chosen to serve quietly, especially those whose previous service required memorizing foreign cities and dangerous routes, so that civilians could navigate safely and confidently in their own communities. Because true geographic expertise doesn't disappear when operations end. It just finds new applications. And sometimes the most valuable intelligence training involves not foreign missions or classified operations, but civilian service that ensures the systematic navigation developed for CIA work can be used to provide dependable transportation and emergency preparedness for everyone.